Throughout League of Legends history, there has been no shortage of absurdly overpowered champions. From champions that were so strong that they needed a hotfix nerf within hours of release, to champions that were so frustrating to deal with that they were nerfed into unplayable states, League has always had some trouble with balancing. There are a ton of champions that could compete for the title of League of Legends' most broken champion. Depending on when you started to play League, your opinion is going to differ. Did you start in beta? Then maybe it's Twisted Fate with an AoE gold card and a basic ability teleport. Did you start in Season 1? It could be Xin Zhao, who still haunts you to this day. Are you a newer League of Legends player? Then it could be Zeri or Aphelios that you think of. This video is going to look at some of the most broken or overpowered champs throughout League's history. But first, let me introduce this video's sponsor, Porofessor. Porofessor is a popular companion app for League of Legends and it provides you with a ton of information both in and out of game. Porofessor will automatically show you the best builds used by top players. This way you don't have to fumble around AFK in base, trying to look up what to build on the champion that you've decided to randomly first time in ranked. Jungle timers are another key feature of Porofessor that can really help out when trying to learn to jungle or how to track the enemy jungler. Even if you already know the Gromp will respawn after 2 minutes and 15 seconds, it's one less thing that you need to track. This lets you focus on what really matters, your 0-10 bot lane. Luckily, you can be mentally prepared for your inting bot lane because Porofessor will let you know if your teammates have not been doing so well lately. You can use this knowledge to hype them up ahead of time so they don't die once and instantly alt F4. Porofessor is free to download and very easy to set up. Click the link below to download it and start using it in your games. Thank you to Porofessor for sponsoring this video, and let's jump back into it. To start with, we have to go way back to the very beginning. It's May 9th of 2009. An unreleased game, League of Legends, has been in closed beta for less than 1 month. A new patch was just released, and this patch brought a bunch of new changes to the game. For one, a new map variant, Summoner's Rift Winter, was added to the game. Along with this, some brand new items. Doran's Ring, Doran's Blade, Banshee's Veil, and the Vision Ward among them. Which, by the way, was an invisible ward that lasted 3 minutes and provided true sight. Zhonya's Ring had just received a rework, and Kage's Lucky Pick, Avarice Blade, and Philosopher's Stone, which were 3 gold-generating items, all received buffs on this patch as well. The summoner spell, Exhaust, was reworked. It no longer silenced champions for the entire duration, and instead blinded the target, causing all attacks to miss. Mixed in with these changes was a rework of a champion named Cardmaster. This, of course, was the champion now known as Twisted Fate. So what was this rework, and what was his kit before? Well, to start with, his passive provided his entire team with a flat 3% crit chance, scaling up to 5%. This rework patch moved his W to his Q. This is wildcards, basically as we know it today. His Q had 2 different iterations before this. The first version was a point-and-click ability that would deal damage over time to any target for up to 7 seconds, or until the enemy killed a unit. A very weird mechanic that we haven't seen since. The second version of his Q was an ability that would cause Cardmaster to deal damage to the target and silence them. The third, new version was Wildcards, the ability that used to be his W. This rework also added Twisted Fate's W, Pick a Card. This ability was very different back then than it is now. Infamously, his gold card would provide AoE damage and an AoE stun. That also worked on towers. His red card was basically the same as it is now, while the blue card allowed him to pick another card. His W sounds absurd, and it was, but this wasn't even the strongest part of his kit. His E allowed him to channel for a short duration and teleport anywhere on the map. Yes, his teleport was a basic ability. Not only was it on a relatively short cooldown, with this new rework, his ultimate would actually improve his E even further. His ultimate provided vision to all enemy champs and slowed them by 40%. In addition, it would now make his teleport instant. Using his teleport without his ultimate active would have him channel before teleporting. If you chose to use his ultimate and then use his E, he would just instantly appear wherever you wanted him to go, ready with an AoE stun. Less than 3 weeks later, Riot would nerf this, making it so that when Destiny is active, TF would channel for 1.5 seconds rather than instantly appearing. Cardmaster, this version of Twisted Fate, is likely the most broken champion of all time. At the very least, he is one of the most broken. When people talk about Beta Twisted Fate being OP, this is the version that they mean. Twisted Fate would stay in this state for quite a while, slowly being nerfed as time went on. In December of 2009, the same patch that introduced Nidalee would also remove his AoE stun. In March of 2010, during Ezreal's release patch, he would finally be reworked to what is mostly the Twisted Fate that we know today. He did have a different passive back then, which provided 2 gold to himself and his allies per unit killed. League was very different back then. There were many different overpowered things, with Twisted Fate being the most memorable. When trying to decide if a champion is overpowered or broken, it has to be measured relative to everything else in the game at that specific point. Annie's stun, for example, lasted 5 seconds in alpha, as opposed to the 1.75 seconds it does now. Ezreal's W on release provided an attack speed increase to all allies, an attack speed decrease to enemies, dealt damage, and also healed allies. Champions have overloaded kits in 2024, but that doesn't mean it didn't also happen in 2009. Even with the many different busted things from League's early days, Twisted Fate was still very broken. I have to mention here, I really recommend going back to old forum posts from back in the day. It's a huge hit of nostalgia, and it's funny to see how differently people used to view the game back then. I also wonder how many of the people who were posting about new champions back in 2010 are still playing League now. Imagine trying to explain that over a decade later, this game would still be very popular and have multi-million-dollar prize pools. During the same time that the Cardmaster was teleporting behind you at instant speed, Jax was also making history. When it comes to Jax, there's a lot to talk about. The very first thing that has to be mentioned is that dodge was a stat in the game at this point. You could get dodge from items like Ninja Tabby, from your masteries, or from your runes, which you had to buy with IP, the in-game currency at the time. Dodge gave you a chance to avoid all damage from an attack. Ninja Tabby, for example, had 12% dodge. If you got auto-attacked, you had a 12% chance to avoid the damage completely. Phantom Dancer alone gave you a 20% dodge chance, and you could stack them. Dodge did not scale additively, so you could not buy 5 Phantom Dancers and have 100% dodge chance. It's a common misconception that you could hit 100% dodge chance. It actually wasn't possible, but you could get it pretty high. During League of Legends Alpha, Jax had a 24% passive dodge chance from his max rank E. During closed beta, it was nerfed to 20%, and again, just 1 month before official release, nerfed to 18%. Just how much dodge could Jax actually get? Just for fun, using his alpha 24% dodge chance with full dodge runes, evasion, quintessence, and seals, which gave 11% dodge, 2% dodge from masteries, and 6 phantom dancers, each giving 20% dodge chance, Jax could have an 82.6% chance to dodge attacks. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you could dodge tower shots, and you could dodge the laser while standing in the enemy fountain. Any champion with 6 Phantom Dancers, dodge runes, and masteries could have a 77% chance to dodge. A lot of people don't know this because it was simply less useful, but Sivir actually had a base 25% chance to dodge while moving as her passive, giving her a maximum of 83% chance to dodge. So obviously, dodge was strong, and Jax is infamous for dodging everything thrown at him. But what about the rest of his kit? Well, he still had his Q, and his W worked basically the same. His E, in addition to the dodge chance, also could be activated after dodging to deal damage and stun in an AoE around him. His ult gave him passive attack speed for a short time every time he landed an attack, scaling up to a maximum. It also made it so that hitting the same unit twice would deal extra damage. When activated, he would gain a flat amount of magic resist, increased by his dodge chance for a short amount of time. It's worth noting that Sword of the Divine was still in the game, and had an active which made it so that your attacks could not be dodged for 5 seconds on a 40-second cooldown. This was intended to be a counter to champion stacking dodge chance. Imagine queuing up in League and the enemy mid laner can teleport behind you at any time starting from level 1. Your team drafted full attack damage, but you have less than an 18% chance to hit the enemy Jax with any of your auto attacks or your towers. This was really something that could happen back in the day. If you happened to queue up on July 13th of 2010, you may have had to play against the newly released champion who was referred to by the community as Win Now. Xin Zhao had just been released, and the week of his release is still mentioned to this day, over a decade later. It's probably the first instance in League of Legends history of Riot releasing a new champion and that champion destroying every single game they were in. Probably the most interesting part about Xin Zhao is that unlike Twisted Fate or Jax, the way his kit worked was not really changed over time, at least until his most recent rework in September of 2017. In his original release, his passive healed him for every third attack he landed. His Q was basically the same, increased damage for 3 attacks with a knock-up on the third. His W increased his attack speed passively, and he could activate his W for more attack speed, and to lower his cooldowns with each attack. His E was a point-and-click dash with an AoE slow. It increased his armor, and also lowered the cooldown of all of his abilities. His ultimate was AoE damage that dealt additional damage based on the enemy's current health, 25% at rank 1, and provided him with armor and magic resist for a short time. As you can tell, there's a lot of cooldown lowering mentioned in his kit, and it basically meant that Xin Zhao would constantly be able to spam his abilities. This, combined with how massively overtuned all of the numbers in his kit were, meant that he was an absolute monster. The community was in an uproar over how strong he was. If Xin Zhao got into range to click E on you, you were basically dead. There is still a ton of clips that you can find of Xin Zhao from this point in time, including this famous one of Hotshot GG playing League on what appears to be a Game Boy Color, and getting essentially a 1v5 pentakill. Building attack speed combined with the cooldown reduction in his kit meant that once he started to hit you, you were going to be constantly CC'd. At least you would be constantly CC'd if you were able to live long enough to actually get CC'd. It may not seem too ridiculous based on today's League, but mobility was not common back then, and even just having one dash was more than most, especially when you consider that his dash would slow you by 40% for 2 seconds at rank 1. It was also usable while rooted, which was also common back then. There are countless posts from people complaining about being one-shot at level 2, or just getting tower dove and dying without being able to do anything. If Xin Zhao was on screen, you were at risk of dying. While champions being busted on release has become completely normal, and even expected, Xin Zhao was the original broken on release champion. So much so that he is still mentioned in discussions about which champion is the most overpowered of all time to this day. 2 weeks after his release, the same patch that introduced Vladimir also heavily nerfed Xin. Vlad himself will need to be talked about more later, but even after these nerfs, Xin would receive multiple more waves of nerfs before finally being considered balanced. My initial idea for this video was to cover all of the most broken champions in League's history, but considering there are still champions from 2009 to talk about, this is definitely going to be a series of videos. There's at least 14 more years of champions to cover, so if you like this sort of content and would like to see more like it, let me know down below. Speaking of broken champions in League, just a few months after Xin Zhao, another champion would be released in an absolutely ridiculous state. Not only would this champion require nerfs, they were so overpowered that they would become the first champion to be hotfix nerfed immediately after release, specifically for balance purposes. Not to fix a bug that caused her to be OP, but because she was just that strong with her kit working as intended. If you played back then, you already know I am talking about LeBlanc. On release, her numbers were so overtuned that the hotfix actually nerfed her entire kit, except for her passive, which really didn't do anything. Her passive, Mirror Image, was mostly the same as what we have now. Her Q, Sigil of Silence, was a little different, and very, very strong. Point and click, deal damage, and mark the target. If you hit the mark target with any other spell, they would take additional damage and also be silenced for 2 seconds. Yes, for a long time she had a silence, and it was as strong as it sounds. This alone made it incredibly frustrating to lane against her, because most champions simply couldn't trade with her at all. By the time the silence ended, LeBlanc was already safe. LeBlanc's W and E were very similar to what we have now. Her E in particular, though, was very frustrating. To start with, it had a base cooldown of 10 seconds at all ranks. For reference, on live, it starts at 14 seconds, scaling down to 11 at max rank. Rank 1 chains was on a lower cooldown than rank 5 is currently. It did take longer to root the target, 2 seconds instead of the 1.5 seconds on live, but it did also slow by 25% until the root occurred. The chain itself also had a much wider hitbox, making it easier to land. The most obnoxious part about this spell, though, was how hard it was to break the tether. The game would check to see if the tether had been broken much less frequently than it currently does. This means that it was extremely common to be out of the tether's range and still get rooted anyway. Anyone who played back then can definitely remember how common it would be to see someone flash out of her tether just to be rooted anyway. This specific feature of the ability would remain in the game for years, until patch 5.11 in June of 2015, when they would increase the check rate for the tether by 400%. Her ultimate allowed her to cast the last spell that she cast again, but dealing much more damage. At rank 1, it increased the damage of the repeated spell by 20%, scaling up to 40%. The Hotfix patch shortly after LeBlanc's release nerfed her base stats and all of her abilities. She lost mana per level and armor per level. Her Q, W, and E all had their base damage reduced and mana cost increased. Her Q lost 50 range, her ult had 10 seconds added to its cooldown, and the base damage amplification was cut in half at rank 1. The nerfs hit her hard, so much so that only 2 weeks later she would begin receiving buffs. Interestingly, if you look at the patch notes, the next 6 times she was adjusted, not including minor bug fixes, was to give her buffs. And those 6 buffs happened over 3 years. From the hotfix on November 4th of 2010 to what was basically a mini rework in July 2013, LeBlanc received only buffs. That's not to say that she was weak during this period. Champions can be made way stronger or much weaker by changing items, runes, and masteries. I just thought it was interesting enough to mention. The early days of League were wild, and there have been many insanely imbalanced and overtuned champions throughout its history. And that's not even looking at everything within League. When you look at items, for example, there are a ton of things that would never make it into the game today, and arguably shouldn't have been in the game to begin with. It's pretty crazy that there are champions from 14 years ago that were so overpowered that players will still mention them to this day, and that these very old champions could be the most broken in the game's history. If I missed something or didn't mention a champion, don't worry. There is a ton left to cover, even just from the early days. Looking for old League content has honestly been a lot of fun and very nostalgic. When you see a video about League posted 14 years ago, looking like it was filmed on a potato, you know it's going to be good content. I really miss the old seasonal winter map, and I wish Riot would go out of their ways to do more things like that. Old League really was a different time, and I can't believe how many old things I had just forgot about. When did you start playing League, and what is the most memorable, nightmarishly OP champion that you remember playing against? Of the champions covered so far, which champion do you think was the most imbalanced? Thanks for watching, and let me know what champions you'd like to see next down below.